What I want to know is how does one get involved in doing rock work as a woman? Do you really, really want to know? Or do you just want the rehearsed response that I always give? What would happen if we chose to really tell the truth about ourselves? Like if we really, really just told the real truth of our lives. I'm not saying that it's true. I'm saying that it's my truth.
You're listening to Hammered.
My grandparents on my mother's side of the family were kind of my favorites. My grandfather was real tall and skinny, and he wore those kind of glasses that didn't really have a frame. It looked just like two glass octagon kind of stop sign glasses with a little wire that kind of wrapped around the back of your ear. He had kind of really thinning, short red hair, kind of, he was older, and he had those kind of wrinkles on your neck that looked like triangles. I remember sitting in the back seat, and I'd always look at his neck, and there were these deep neck creases, and he wore a hat, kind of like a Bonnie and Clyde hat when we would go to town or something, and my grandmother would be in the front seat with him, and she was kind of short, and she had really, really beautiful, really crystal blue eyes. And I think that was always my attraction to blue eyes, is her eyes were just, I could just almost look into her soul. And I favored her, and I think it disturbed my mother, because she would say things to me sometimes like, "You really look like Mother," and she would almost cry, and I never really understood that. And I don't know if it was because I was a disappointment to her, or I just don't really know why that upset her. But we would go in the car, and they had this really fat Chihuahua named Penny Kelly. And Penny was kind of protective, and she'd be in the middle of them up in the front seat, and she'd kind of growl at me and my sister in the back seat. And Penny was black, and she had a little tan kind of diamond on her chest. And I never saw dog food. It was like they would scrape the leftovers out on this concrete pad off the back porch to feed Penny, and she would eat, chicken bones and whatever, but she was kind of overweight, and she'd waddle around. But I loved being at their house. It was like heaven on earth. And when I would go there in the summers, I would go maybe like a week at a time, and I would do all these chores. And I really loved doing the chores. I didn't mind at all. I hated doing chores at home. But at their house, I wanted to help them. And so I would sweep the porches and wash the porches and cut the grass. And my granddaddy, Papa Kelly, he would show me how to sharpen the lawnmower blade. And we would work on this lawnmower blade and sharpen it, and it was like a razor. It would be so sharp, and put it on the lawnmower, and I would cut the grass, and he and my grandmother would be sitting on the front porch, and they had this long front yard, and I would go up and down and up and down. And every time I would come down and see them on the porch, they'd sort of wave, and I would turn and go back up. And it would just fill up my heart. Like I was just so happy to be there. And I would sleep in the front bedroom, and I could hear the train come by at night. And the train would sort of wake you up, and then it would have that ongoing and you could hear it on the tracks, and it was like my heart would beat to the sound of of that train hitting those tracks, and I would go back to sleep. And she had these really sheer curtains, and I remember the fresh air coming into the room, and the curtains would sort of blow. And I felt so safe and so happy, and the beds were perfect, and they were always these eyelet sort of bedspreads and white clean sheets. I think she ironed the sheets. And she would wake me up in the morning, and she would cook these breakfasts that were just like unbelievable, kind of like a farm breakfast. And they had a barn, and they had fresh eggs and chickens and hogs and all kinds of muscadines in the garden and just everything. And I remember one afternoon, me and my nanny, we called her Nanny, we were sitting on the back porch, and she had hurt her wrist, and she had this little splint on her wrist. And I said, "Does it hurt, Nanny?" And she said, "Well, not too bad." And we were both in these rocking chairs, and I reached over and I held her hand, and we were rocking. And I remember her looking over me through the screen on the porch down into this field. And in the field there was just thousands and thousands of Queen Anne's lace, and they were in bloom. And she said, "Queen Anne's lace, that's my favorite flower." And I remember I just watched her as she said it, and I watched her eyes just look off in a distance. And I looked up at her and I said, "Mine too, Nanny. Mine too, that's my favorite flower too." And I just remember the love that I had for both of them. And Papa Kelly was real funny. And at lunch, which was they called dinner, we would sit down, and I would be on one end of the table, and Papa was on the other end, and Nanny was in the middle. And he'd reach up into this medicine cabinet that was above his chair, and he'd get all these different pills, and he lined them up by his plate. And he would sort of whistle. He whistled Rock of Ages like 24 hours a day. And he would whistle it. And if you ask him something, or if Nanny asked him something, he would stop midstream in whistling Rock of Ages, answer the question, talk or whatever, and then go right back to where he left off. I don't know how he kept up with it. I guess it was just like a natural reflex. But I would always wonder why he had all those pills and if he was sick. But we would have lunch, and he'd take those pills, and then he would go out on the back porch and lay on this couch, and he'd always read the funny papers. And he would have the funny papers, and then he would lay the funny papers on his chest and fall asleep. Well, I would continue doing like little chores, and I'd go wash the car. I wanted to please him so bad that I would just keep doing all these things. And so my mother had told me a few things about my grandfather, not a whole lot. But he was a big storyteller, and he would tell these stories about, there was this creature, this person that lived down in the woods called Mole's Moose. And my sister and I would be so scared. And I think he was telling us this to kind of keep us out of the woods. And there was another character that he said, "Don't go down in those woods too deep, because Tandy Pocus will get you." And I'm like, who the hell's Tandy Pocus? So these were always like these kind of stories. But Nanny would let me pot plants. She would root plants, cuttings of plants in jars, and you'd see the long, white, stringy roots. And she would have me pot them, and she set me up a little potting stand in the cellar. And I would get up on this stool, and I would pot the plants and put them in dirt, and I was just in heaven. I was so happy to be there, and it was like there wasn't any time. It was just, you were just in that moment. And I remember walking around the base of the cellar door, and she had all these elephant ears, and they were like the size of the hood of the car. They were huge. The only time she ever got mad at me is I remember I broke one of them off one time, and me and my sister were playing like we were Egyptians or something, and I was fanning her with one of these elephant ears. And it really upset my nanny, and I think she might have even like given us a whipping with a little stick. But it really broke my heart because I didn't ever want to disappoint her. But I remember one time it was a big family gathering, and my papa came into the hallway, and I was kind of hiding. I don't know why I was in that hallway, but I was sort of beside this piece of furniture, and I saw him put his hands up against the wall, and it was kind of dark, but I could see his silhouette, and he had kind of a long nose, and he was leaning. He had his hands against the wall, kind of like when you get frisked by police. And he put his forehead on the wall, and he just looked like he was just in pain. And I couldn't understand why he was doing that. And in the other room, my grandmother had gotten out this little serving tray with this crystal bottle, and it had this homemade muscadine wine. And all the other relatives were having just a little bit in a little glass, almost like a shot glass. And I remember him just almost crying, and I couldn't understand it. But then I started kind of putting it together that he couldn't have any of that muscadine wine. And so later on, my mother had started telling me little bits and pieces about her history, and how Papa was sort of like the drunk of the town, and that after work he would go and drink, and my grandmother would have to go to town and find him, and how they were so poor, and they would wait for him to come home, and he would come home and he would be so angry, and he would drink all his paycheck up, and how on Sundays he would be coming down and be hung over, and he would threaten to kill himself, and my grandmother would cry and beg him not to, and tell my mother and her brother, "You've got to stop him, you got to stop him. What are we going to do?" And it was this dance, and he would pretty much probably manipulate my grandmother with this threat of killing himself just to get her off of his back. And the reason I kind of say that is because I had become this same way. I was always figuring out ways to justify my behaviors, and I just couldn't help it, and I knew that Papa couldn't help it. And then my mother told me a story about after she had my brother, and he was a baby, and it was winter time, and they'd gone up to my grandparents' house, and I wasn't even born yet, but the men had been nipping on the sauce, she said. And my father and my uncle and my granddaddy got out in the yard, and Papa Kelly pulled a knife on my dad, and they were drunk, and they'd been sneaking, drinking, and my mother wrapped up my brother. And she said, "You're never going to see your grandson again," and threatened and left. And my Nanny Kelly was pleading with her, "Dottie, please don't do this to us. Don't leave like this, please," and just crying and begging. And that next week, my Papa Kelly, he went up to the town doctor, and he says, "I got to get off the sauce." And he just immediately writes Papa Kelly whatever the prescriptions he needed. And my Papa Kelly never drank again. But he switched over to Valium and barbiturates and who knows. But I never saw a bad side to him as a child. All I heard was Rock of Ages being whistled, and I think my grandparents had made peace with each other. My grandmother, she sort of had a worried look on her face, and I always noticed that. Well, around 13, she died suddenly, and it was the worst thing at that point that had ever happened to me or my family. And the night it happened, I remember going to her house, and I remember my mother going in and grabbing her dress off of the back of the door and just holding her dress and smelling her dress and just wailing and crying. And I could not deal with it. And I was crying and I was hurting. And we were all in such pain because my grandmother was only 67 years old. And I was about 12 and a half going on 13. And my cousin Vicky was there. And Vicky was like my idol. I loved her so much. She was a teenager. She was older than me. She was about 16. And she was beautiful, and she had the Kelly eyes. She had the real blue eyes like my grandmother, and they were kind of like smiling eyes. And we held hands, and we sat out on the back porch, and I basically just clung on to Vicky, and she had this copper-colored Firebird that she'd gotten. She was going to Mercer. After high school, she was going to go to college, and she had some plans, and I just really adored her. And I stayed sort of close by her because my mother couldn't deal, and my mother couldn't be there for us, and my daddy just sort of went silent. He was actually pretty gentle during this time, but it was a very, very hard time. But the day of the burial, they had a morning viewing, and I remember I was sitting there, and it got kind of quiet, and they said, "Here she comes." And my nanny was up there in the casket, and I'd already been standing by the casket for just hours the day before, and just touching her dead body. I would touch her hand, and I would hold her hand, and it was cold and weird. And I just kept staring at her and just thinking, where did you go? And why did you leave me? All I knew is that she had left me. I knew everybody else was in pain too, but they couldn't possibly feel what I was feeling. And I heard people say, "Here she comes." And so some of the cousins and some of the relatives, all women, they were bringing in this little frail body, and it was Granny Higgins, and it was Nanny Kelly's mother. And Nanny Kelly was the oldest of 9 kids. There might have been 10 kids. I know a couple of them died. One of them died in the war. A couple of babies died. But here comes Granny Higgins. And she's kind of bent over, and she's very small and frail, and she's already probably in her 80s, I think, and they're walking her toward the casket, and I felt like my heart was going to explode. I could not handle the amount of pain that was surging through my chest. And when she got up to the casket, she looked down, and she had Parkinson's, and so her head was trembling. Her hands were trembling, and she put her hand over her mouth, and she said, "Oh, honey." And I literally thought I was going to die. Back at my dad's apartments, I was sort of hanging out with a lot of the different people there. I was really trying to steer clear from Allison and Lisa. After that last encounter, I knew I had better just stay away from them and just kind of get a new life. And I would go sell ice cream out in the rural areas. I would go to places like Buford Dam, where there would be a lot of people hanging out at the lake and in the sun. And I'd go to Lake Altoona, and I would just sort of steer clear because I knew that was really a bad situation, and I did not want to go around them anymore. And I started hanging out a little bit with Michael's mother, Patsy, and so she would drink really horrible Schlitz malt liquor and smoke Cool King cigarettes. But I would sit over there and drink with her and kind of get to know her a little bit. And it was kind of odd because I was really close to Michael, and I could tell that it was making him uncomfortable for me to be around his mother. He was very embarrassed of her. And so she would sort of start telling me, why don't you come on down to the bar? And so her sister owned Tallulah's, the real kind of chic women's bar on Piedmont Avenue. And I would go down, and now I had become sort of on the inside crowd. I knew the owners, and they would let me stay after hours. And so after the bar would close, then we would have like the party after the bar, and I would do coke, and we would play pool and drink. And they were all older than me, but they would kind of let me hang around because Patsy had let them know that I was okay. And there was another lady in the apartment complex, and she was a single mother, and her name was Terry. She was a flower designer at Rich's department store, and she drove a little banged up Toyota Corolla, kind of a dark green with some dents in it, and she had a little boy named Billy, and she drank a lot, and I would sit with her, and we would drink Evan Williams, and sort of got to know her a little bit. And so I was just sort of really trying to hang around at my dad's, and then I would go with Tina in the wheelchair and her hand-controlled car, and Michael and I, and we would try to make meals and cook spaghetti and kind of have these little dinners, and we were just trying to have some kind of normalcy. And all of a sudden I remember that tickets were going on sale for Prince at the Turtles record store. And so I talked Tina and Michael going with me and camp out and get these tickets. And so we were out there, and we were out waiting, and it was kind of chilly, I remember, but we were way back in line. And so Tina was having to go to the restroom. And so she says, she's pretty outspoken. And she said, I'm just going to roll up and ask that cop up there if I can go in and use the restroom. And she had a colostomy bag, so I don't really know how she was going to go to the restroom. I don't know if she just had to go in there and deal with that. I'm not sure. But she rolled up all the way to the front of the line, and Michael and I stayed back, and she told the policeman, and they opened the door. He banged on the door, and the Turtles Records employees opened the door, and they let her in. And we saw her head kind of rolling through the record store, and then we waited, and we saw her rolling back out, and she talked to the policeman. We could see her talking to the policeman, and she started pointing back to where we were. And so he came outside, and he said, "You two." And he was talking to me and Michael, and he goes, "Come up here." And we come up, and he said, "Y'all wait up here in front of the line." And so when they opened the door to start selling the tickets, we ran up to the counter, and we ordered our tickets. And we couldn't believe it. We could not believe it that we were going to be able to get front row seats to Prince, the Purple Rain tour. Was it even possible that this was going to happen? And we were so excited. And when we went to that concert, I'll never forget it. It was like a spiritual experience being right there on that front. But I remember seeing Tina in that wheelchair and just her looking up on that stage. And I remember how happy she was. And I remember how Michael was so happy. And I felt like that I had these two souls that were such, they were such kind, loving people. And they had such horrendous backgrounds. And I loved them. And I knew that I was part of them and that they were part of me. And for that moment, everything felt okay in the world. I felt like that I was going to be okay. Well, I kept going back to the ice cream shop, and I would sneak in and out sort of when I knew Allison and Lisa wouldn't be there to get my ice cream, to get whichever van, and to take off. Well, this one night, I run into them, and they're at the shop. And Allison looks at me, and I thought, I got to face this. And so she kind of nodded her head at me. And Lisa was just sort of there, and she sort of looked at me. And it was almost like Lisa had taken all the blame and she had smoothed everything over. And Allison kind of looked at me and said, hey, if you want to come down, we're having a little get-together. If you want to come down to our apartment. Well, there I was. There I was again. Is this even a choice? Should this even be a choice? I knew better. I knew better. And it was that devil angel on my shoulder. It would whisper in my ear. And it would tell me, don't do it. You know better than this. And then the other side would say, oh, it'll be all right. You can just go down for a little while. Just go down for a little while. So I went down, and I had my motorcycle, and I had parked the ice cream truck. So I went down and I followed them, and we got down there and started doing a little drinking, and Allison had some acid, and I took a hit of acid. And I remember drinking and drinking and drinking, and I remember different characters started coming in and out of the apartment. And I wasn't quite sure who these people were, but it was some rough characters, biker-looking guys, and kind of hardcore, not very friendly. And I remember the bathroom door being sort of halfway open, and I saw Lisa sitting on the counter in the bathroom, and the door was open maybe like a foot. And I saw this guy, and he was wrapping a band around her arm. And I remember thinking, no, 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 oh my God. And they pulled a syringe, and right as the guy was about to inject her arm, she looked and she saw me looking at her. And I had that flash go through my mind of Jane Fonda in They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And how she had begged Michael Sarrazin to shoot her in the head. And the way she looked at me, she had sort of a smile, but sort of a sadness, and sort of an emptiness, but sort of a I can't do anything about this look. And I just remember thinking, no, this is so bad. This is so bad. And then they shut the door. And all I remember is that I just drank, and I was tripping, and I was drinking, and people came out and they did cocaine, and it was kind of like a fucking Ryan's Steakhouse food bar, except it was drugs. The gluttony and the intensity of more and more and more, but nothing is given any kind of relief to this insatiable appetite for numbness. Just numb this pain, just kill this pain, just kill these thoughts, just stop it. And it wouldn't stop. And all I remember is I was laying in the floor sort of face down, and I felt something behind me. And I sort of rolled over, and it was Lisa. And she laid down behind me, and she took her clothes off, and she pulled me real close to her. And I just remember laying there, and I felt this sadness, and I felt like, are we just going to die or what? And I passed out again, and I woke up to something hitting me in the back of the head. I was being bashed in the back of the head with my own motorcycle helmet. And I woke up, and it was Allison, and she was in a rage. And I guess she had come out of wherever she was and saw Lisa laying behind me and just went ballistically crazy. And she was beating me in the head and beating me in the head. And just, so all I knew to do in my defense, I just completely unleashed on her. it was almost like all this rage just came out onto her. And I remember running after I grabbed my motorcycle helmet, and I ran down, and it seemed like it was maybe, 4 o'clock in the morning. I had no idea, but it was raining. And I got on that motorcycle, and I could barely see to ride it. And I remember riding, and it was like the raindrops were falling on my head, but they were like bricks. And it was because of this acid. I was still tripping. And I was riding, and the lights were coming toward me. I thought, I'm going to get killed here. I don't think I'm going to be able to make it to my dad's. So I was just riding and praying to whatever kind of God was there. I knew God hated me. I knew God just probably was just going to go ahead and kill my ass and send me to fucking hell, even though I already felt like I was in hell. I thought, well, how can it get any worse? And then I remember having the thought, I'll just go to Regina's, because it wasn't far from there. And I remember I pulled into the parking space, and the parking space was sort of at an angle. And I was sort of relieved that I had made it there. And I was getting off the motorcycle. Well, I'd forgot to put the kickstand, and when I did, the motorcycle fell completely over downhill onto my leg and just flipped me over with it. So the motorcycle's laying on my left side of my body, and I can't get up. I can't get up, and it's burning my leg through my pants. And finally, I tapped into that place that I often refer to. And when I tapped into that place, I was able to get that thing off of me, and I lifted it up. I put the kickstand. As I turned around, I saw the door opening, and Regina was standing there in a robe, and she was looking at me really quietly. And she said, "Are you ready to give up yet?"
Hammered is recorded and produced in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Asheville, North Carolina. It's narrated by Jill Haynie, produced by Maggie Briggs and Jill Haynie, and with sound design, editing, and music by Alexander Rodriguez. Our beautiful artwork was created by Lauren Caddick, and we'd like to send a special thanks out there to Minnie and Robin. You can check out our website, podcasthammered.com, and follow us on social media for updates.